Today I'm going to talk about the sculpture The Death of Cleopatra, completed in 1876 by the American sculptor Edmonia Lewis. Edmonia Lewis is not a name that everyone will be familiar with, but she was an extraordinary figure, not only because she was a professional female sculptor working in the 19th century, but also because she was of African American and Native American descent. And in this and a couple of future fireside chats, I hope to be able to talk more about some of the art that highlights the expression and the experiences of Black America. This piece, like many African American contributions to American life, has only recently been rediscovered. Despite being a sculptural centerpiece of the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, it disappeared fairly soon after and was only found again in a salvage yard in 1987 and acquired after that by the Smithsonian for public restoration and display. Being invited to display at that exposition was the crescendo of Edmonia Lewis's groundbreaking career. She was born free in 1844 in upstate New York, some 20 years before the end of slavery in the rest of the country. Orphaned at the age of 9, her brother was the stabilizing force in her early life, and it was during her subsequent schooling her prodigious artistic talents were noticed. Now, ordinarily, there would be limited, if any, opportunities for a young black girl to exploit such talents. But her brother managed to enlist the support of the abolitionist societies, who, in the last decades before the Civil War, were very eager to create African American success stories. And so with her talents recognized, the abolitionist charities raised enough money for her to attend Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the very few in the country, and in fact the world, that was accepting both female and African American students to study art. Despite this progressive attitude, Lewis still faced discrimination and racism daily at the school. During her 3 years there, she was accused of attempts to poison her friends, she was accused of stealing art supplies from classmates, and at one stage even she was beaten severely by unknown assailants and left to die in a field outside the university grounds. She survived though, and she was eventually acquitted of all accusations as no evidence ever surfaced. But the school authorities, regardless, decided she was of ill moral character and refused to enroll her for her final semester. And subsequently she left Oberlin without receiving her diploma. But regardless, Lewis has her education, and so she moves to Boston to start her career. And there she's helped once again by the abolitionist societies who try and promote her career as an up-and-coming sculptor. Now, one of the most common outlets for sculptors in the 19th century was portraiture busts, which were very popular and stylish in Victorian homes. When she's arrived there in 1864, it's the waning years of the Civil War. Union Army heroes are very common subjects. Lewis does do several of prominent Union generals, but in particular, it's a miniature bust she does of Robert Gould Shaw, who was a Bostonian who commanded the 1st African American Regiment in the Union Army. That's an early breakthrough. The Shaw family love it. They purchase it for a good price, but Lewis makes a cast of the work and starts selling plaster reproductions for $15 each, and it's a big bestseller. Portrait medallions were another early bestseller. This one of Wendell Phillips, another Bostonian abolitionist and an advocate of Native American rights, sold many copies. So what's interesting about all this is that far from the life of a poor and struggling young artist, within just 2 years, Edmonia Lewis has sold more than enough busts and medallions to become independently wealthy. And so much so that by 1866 she's able to fund a first trip to Rome, and from that point on she'll actually spend most of her life there. Many American artists of the period do live in expatriate communities in Europe, and in Rome there is a prominent circle of artists and sculptors, led by the eccentric Bostonian actress Charlotte Cushman. But for Lewis, it's also far easier to live in Italy as a black woman. Although there is undeniable racism and discrimination there as well, it's far less overt and far less difficult to navigate than it is in America in the tumultuous aftermath of the Civil War. By the end of the 1860s, Lewis is the toast of Rome. Her studio is a bit of a tourist attraction. She also has many wealthy patrons back in the United States, which, after the Civil War, was coming into the height of a neoclassical craze, and statuaries like Lewis's was very much desired. There are exhibitions of her work in major cities, and she also picked up major public commissions to do statues on things like courthouses and town halls, some of which were worth tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune in its day. So it's really at the height of a successful career that Lewis is invited to participate in the Centennial Exposition of 1876. Marking the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the World Fair in Philadelphia that year was to be the grandest of its day, and like any 19th century World's Fair, the opportunity to formally exhibit was major recognition as an artist. It's also an incredible moment for Lewis as a black artist. Pennsylvania had only abolished its slave trade less than 3 decades prior, and of course, only a decade had passed since the Civil War. Her submission, The Death of Cleopatra. It was monumental, just under 2 meters in height and carved from marble, weighing nearly 1,500 kilograms. It depicts Cleopatra, the legendary queen of Egypt, in the throes of death, succumbing to poison from the bite of an asp. Daring, ambitious, and treacherous women, like the Bible's Judith and Delilah, or the ancient Greek Cassandra, were very popular artistic subjects in this period. Cleopatra particularly so, and indeed, major artists in just about every century have tried to capture her timeless image. But Lewis's composition still manages to be unique, unusual, and thought-provoking for a few reasons. The first is the upright seated position. Cleopatra's death is nearly always depicted with her reclining or lying down on a chaise lounge or a daybed. Yet placing her on a throne changes the tone of the story entirely, conveying a sense of power and authority, even in death, rather than fragility and femininity. Secondly, most depictions of Cleopatra portray her as a great Western beauty, a true femme fatale, often extremely pale, with very fair and fine European features, almost like a nymph of ancient Greek legend. And even modern depictions of Cleopatra have tended to carry on this tradition. Yet the Ptolemies were extremely inbred, and their descendants were reported as having thicker features, particularly noses, cheeks, and necks, than their Greek heritage would suggest. They also struggled with weight, both possibly the result of inherited genetic thyroid and endocrine problems. Moreover, nearly 3 centuries in Egypt had seen the Ptolemies take on some distinctive local characteristics in their appearance, perhaps the legacy of Egyptian royal mistresses, and or significant differences in diet, lifestyle, and climate. In any case, Lewis for her sculpture ignored traditional paintings and focused exclusively on the coins minted in Cleopatra's time for clues as to actual likeness, and modern reconstructions of Cleopatra's appearance suggest that she got a lot closer to the reality than most artists. But finally, what I find particularly intriguing is the facial expression. If you look at other paintings of Cleopatra's death over the centuries, they will show her face either writhed with torment as she commits the final act, or in a sort of expressionless repose. None of them, that I've found at least, show her with an expression of serene, quiet happiness that Lewis's Cleopatra seems to have. This may suggest an interesting interpretation. Conventionally, Cleopatra is depicted as a semi-tragic victim of her own scheming, often with the moral subtext suggesting that it's the inevitable end for an ambitious seductress. Lewis, however, seems to depict Cleopatra reveling in final victory, insofar as her suicide, in the words of the Roman historian Cassius Dio, robbed Augustus of the full splendor of his victory and thwarted his plan to have her march through Rome as his conquest. And indeed, seated on her throne, Lewis seems to suggest that Cleopatra, even in death, remained a queen in control of her destiny. As Lewis herself is quoted as saying, "I have a strong sympathy for all women who have struggled and suffered." You may be wondering where the fabled asp is. It seems to be a long tradition for the artist to find a way to unobtrusively include the antagonist of the scene, leaving the viewer to search for it. Lewis does not make it apparent from the primary viewing angle. You have to view her from the opposing side to find the asp curled around her right hand. Cleopatra's disheveled appearance in a state of partial undress was both riveting and repulsive to viewers at the fair. To depict Cleopatra as such is fairly common in paintings, but it was not the prevailing style in neoclassical statuary of the time, and it was provocative by the American mores of the day. The unladylike pose particularly with her legs splayed and the folds of her robe forming a suggestive valley between her thighs. Well, that was particularly bold for the moralistic American public of the 1870s, though not so, perhaps, in continental Europe. And of course, though, the whiff of controversy made their work extremely popular. It was one of the most visited sculptures at the fair. But why did Lewis pick this subject in the first place? After all, while in Rome, she'd completed many sculptures of Black and Native American people and scenes. So why didn't she contribute something like this to the fair? Well, as an African American woman exhibiting at the exhibition and celebrating America's centennial in a very tempestuous post-Civil War environment, Lewis knew the scrutiny placed upon her would be enormous. The committee overseeing the sculpture hall would adamantly resist any submission that even hinted of politics or was likely to offend its largely white audience. With very clear limits on how far she might push the envelope, the submission of the Death of Cleopatra is a subject that was well established and popular, but it still had many opportunities to be rendered in ways that were novel and daring. Moreover, the association of Cleopatra with Africa, with strong femininity, well, these are both historic and undeniable, and it's perhaps as close to depicting an African subject as Lewis might have hoped to be able to do without arousing political controversy and possible censure. The material is another interesting and convenient mask. By rendering Cleopatra in gleaming white of the neoclassical revival, the matter of the racial colouring of her subject is neatly sidestepped. And importantly, Cleopatra's two slaves who died with her, who are very commonly included in paintings of the scenes of her death, well, these are left out of her work. The exposition was the high watermark of her career, and although she gained great attention and popularity at the fair, by the 1880s neoclassicism was ending as an artistic fashion, and Lewis, although with many admirers in Rome still, was gradually forgotten as an international name. She spent much of her later career working on private commissions for Catholic churches and families in Italy, for whom neoclassicism remained popular. Lying unsold for years and having it found its way into some storage in Chicago, the Death of Cleopatra itself was finally purchased at a bargain price by a local gambler and racetrack owner named Blind John Condon, who had it placed as a cenotaph at his racetrack commemorating the death of one of his favourite horses, named Cleopatra. When the racetrack was converted into a golf course in the 1920s, the statue stayed around and ended up becoming part of a water trap on the course. In the 1970s, the course closed and it was moved to a salvage yard. Fortunately, it was never scrapped. And in the 1980s, a local Boy Scout troop noticed the statue and brought it to the attention of local historians, who, at long last, discovered its true provenance. Though damaged from many years of exposure and painting, it was largely restored and is now on display at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C., an enduring testament to the pioneering career of the first generation of Black Americans who are at long last getting their chance to speak to the world.